Trump is very good at smelling the diplomatic air, whether or not he agrees with it or not. And I think if the Russians opened up for the third time another front near Kharkiv, during all of this, first of all, that disrupts the talks, which we said after the second round, and it calls out the Russians for who they are, what they are.
Hello and welcome to the Trump Report for Times Radio. I'm Louis Sykes. Today we're joined by retired Brigadier General Peter Zwack, former US Senior Defense Attaché to the Russian Federation between 2012 and 2014, and author of the book Swimming the Volga, a US Army officer's experiences in pre-Putin Russia. Peter was also in Russia at the beginning of Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2014. Peter, welcome.
Hey, great to see you.
I wanted to start by asking how you felt this drive for peace by the US administration has progressed. I mean, are we closer to peace now than we were in 2024?
Potentially, yes. I think what we're seeing is high-level geostrategic poker being played. And what President Trump did do is put the ball in Putin's court, and that with the first discussions just 10 days ago now, I thought that with the discussions with Ukraine, talking about partial ceasefire and other things that the Russians didn't like. The administration with Ukraine took the initiative. And it was very important because Putin would have seen the real dust up in the Oval Office between Zelensky and Trump just a few weeks ago, and also righted that. But now, it put Putin and the Russians, Lavrov, into a complicated situation because they're also playing to their world court, and to just sit there and not respond or respond opaquely. The negotiating team, the Western negotiating team, Ukraine, US, and friends and allies, had the initiative. They took the initiative. And I think that the Russians were ruminating on that for some time, and then came back with this, and came back with, I think it was Ushakov mentioning that yes, they would consider a partial ceasefire with conditions, and basically in the conditions are pre 2022 borders, meaning they wanted to be able to keep their new Russian oblasts in Kherson and Zaporizhia and Luhansk and Donetsk, and by the way, Crimea from 2014, and then started to play hardball in this. This is just going to give the Ukrainians pause to regroup, and the Kursk business hadn't been fully settled yet. And I think that one reason we see the Russian push so hard, and basically now finishing off the Kursk salient, is with they wanted to take that out from the Ukrainian game book, playbook, and so that was very interesting for folks that want to go out on YouTube and follow. Just a couple of days ago was Putin meeting Lukashenko of Belarus. And if you watch that and listen to the words, he laid out the whole proposed position while pulling Belarus more visibly as an ally, which has been a back and forth. So it set the stage now for the next round, where what is interesting is we've seen now in the last 2 days that Putin is gone back and now hit the ball back and said, no, we're not going to support this without considering these conditions. And I touched on that. So it is high level gamesmanship that has bits of brinkmanship thrown in, when the Russians will slip out nuclear weapons and all of that. And so I like to say that it's gamesmanship that turns into brinksmanship. And our side also has played harder with its words. And I think very, very significantly, and this is why I mean it's like a playbook, negotiating the art of making a deal, is when we had a round of discussions. It mostly satisfied our desires. Ukrainians went in on it, and what did we do? We let off on the arms, not embargo, but arms stoppage, and that was very, very support in our overall position. So the ball is in play now, and the Russians have backed off. They've regained somewhat the initiative, but we're now very much in the game, and I hate calling it that, but I think there's some real diplomatic gamesmanship going on here.
And US support, as you say, has now resumed for Ukraine, just in time, it seems, as the Ukrainians claim that Russia is massing troops on the border near Sumy. They're worried there could be a new offensive to try and get around the back of Kharkiv or something along those lines.
Yeah, I've been worried about Kharkiv for a long time because it sits out there. Kharkiv, you write a book about. It's a remarkable city historically, and certainly throughout the conflict since 2014. Kharkiv stands, and it's right 30 miles off the border, and it stands. And there's been a lot of Russian activity north and south, right into the whole Donetsk, and then Sumy area and all of that. But it's been threatened but not taken. It was also bitterly fought for in World War II between the Soviets and the Germans.
And so should Kiev be worried that if a new offensive starts there, though, from the Russians, there might not be as much support from Washington this time to help stop a new Russian offensive?
I think it will be different. I think that Trump is very good at smelling the diplomatic air, whether or not he agrees with it or not. And I think if the Russians opened up for the third time another front near Kharkiv, during all of this, first of all, that disrupts the talks, which we said after the second round, and it calls out the Russians for who they are, what they are. But Kharkiv is vulnerable. and the pullback from the Kursk area is, I think, it's recognition by the Ukrainians. They've been overstretched, and in dangerous territory. And one other thing in all this, can't forget the North Koreans are in this. I mean, it's really, really, who could have imagined the situation even 2 years ago, 3 years ago? And I think that, and we'll talk all about that on May 9th.
And Zelensky has said, however, that the situation in the Donbass and Donetsk has, especially Pokrovsk, has stabilized more. We know Putin still wants to complete his annexation of those regions that you mentioned earlier in the Donbass. How crucial is it that the US backs Ukraine's ability to keep what they have, what they still hold in that region?
This will be a fight in Congress. If they're encountering problems with the administration, because that is back to the invasion. And there are some in our government that will say, but there had been Ukrainian oppression in these Russian dominant oblasts, and it's rightfully part of Russia. So there's that backdrop. I mean, that would be the argument for doing it and continuing it. And that's one of Putin's conditions, and he's been locked on that, is that we want all of these four oblasts. He'll say, back to in Russia, but that's aggression, and we've argued about it twice, in 2014, 2015, and you had with that the Minsk Accords, all of that. So that's very much in play. And of course, the other two oblasts to the south that I mentioned. So I think we would have to be harder if they play outside the parameters of what has been talked about in the last week. How heavily we would support? I don't know, but we're sending back the arms diplomatically more in that lane, and the European factor is important. The Europeans have been buttressing, if you will, the parapets, and really, really pulling together and being very, very supportive of Ukraine. And the devil is in the details. And I've been a peacekeeper in Kosovo, and working with Britfor, and it's edgy out there. If there are peacekeepers, what are the rules of engagement? How angry and vicious is the fight? Is the so-called peacekeeping not peace enforcement? Nobody wants to get into the peace enforcement business. How does it play? But in that world, the Russians are now playing to the world court, and they have, they have countries that have been fence sitting, that are, part of the Shanghai Accord and all of that. So there's a lot out there. If they think that Russia has taken it too far. And again, I think that the fair-minded people in our Congress would, if it happens again, and it's seen as a betrayal or added aggression, may vote for more support, and that could run the full range of things. However, there is acute discomfort with putting U.S. military peacekeepers on the ground in Ukraine. certainly between Russian and Ukrainian forces. But we could support that if Europe, as Europe has been stating, a number of key nations decides to carry that torch.
Well, on the European nations, I mean, Britain's Prime Minister Keir Starmer made an announcement just yesterday that his coalition of the willing, European countries that would supply troops are moving to an operational phase. How important will it be for Europe to have those troops standing by, that kind of peacekeeping force? And do you think that'll make America more willing to use that in negotiations?
Yes, and I think that there's more to this. It's a great question. Yes, peacekeeping as a backstop certainly is possible, but it's also Europe is buttressing, and we are. They have also NATO and EU nations to be worried about, especially the Baltic republics, um, um, Poland, and then you have Moldova. There's more potentially beyond just beyond the Ukrainian territories.
Kursk is clearly crucial for Putin in these negotiations, as you've mentioned. I mean, he's going to some extremes to retake what the Ukrainians hold in that region. We've seen pictures from the city of Sudza that just show an immense bombardment has clearly taken place on Russian soil. I mean, how crucial is Kursk going to be in Putin's mind before he even gets to the negotiating table?
Well, I mean, Kursk, the Ukrainian assault into surprise assault into Kursk was embarrassing for the Russians on many fronts. And the fact that the Ukrainians have been there 6 months, in my mind, shows that the Donetsk fighting has been a whole lot harder than the Russians thought. And you talked about Pokrovsk. They didn't expect to get into yet another Verdun fight. As we've seen now, sadly, several of them. And so Kursk also, when we talk about Victory Day and things like that coming up, it's not as much as Volgograd, Stalingrad, but it is military holy ground for the Russian Soviets. And it wasn't just Kursk city, the whole region. You had the biggest battle, arguably, in the Second World War, and most tanks involved. And that's part of the historiography. And so for the Ukrainians to be in there was embarrassing, hugely embarrassing for the Russians. And the fact they didn't get into it till now says they were parsing out troops at that point very, very carefully. And the Donetsk the Donbass was more important for all the reasons we know, and we'll get to Kursk. And now they've got enough headroom that they can do it. And now there's urgency to do it, to finish it off, so it's not a bargaining chip for Ukraine now.
And you mentioned there, May 9th, we've spoken about a couple of times now, and, the significance for the Russians of these emblems of what Putin believes is Russia's great history. How crucial could that upcoming May 9th Victory Day be for this? Is that going to become something of a soft target for Putin, do you think, to get a ceasefire sewn up by?
I'm going to give you a perspective of Victory Day from the eyes of a U.S. NATO defense attaché in Moscow in 2012, which was before, the time of troubles in 2013 all the way up to now. I was in seating in the VIP stands for that Kursk parade in 2012. And they were all there. Putin was there, Gerasimov, and all of them were there. And there was a pretty large foreign contingent. And they were marching and hoorah, and praising the old veterans who are dying off. It was also a family day at that time. It was a celebration. Then there was 2013, and I was in Moscow this time in blue jeans, watching from the sideline, and yeah, it was all there. But the Allied NATO official support, very few attaches were there at the time. Of course, you had their so-called allies and the fence-sitting nations there, and it was a show off of firepower and the usual thing. But that time was fascinating because you had Russian tanks and tracks driving by with a pennants with the seals of Donetsk and Luhansk, and then in 2014 we entirely boycotted it, and 2014 is when I was there on the sideline. 2015 is when 14 was when we boycotted it because the Russians were in Crimea. And could you believe it? They were. And for the diplomatic missions, ours, our allies, our friends, there was a period. What do we do? Do we go there traditionally? Remember, we had the American contingent march, I think it was 2009, in the parade, military contingent. So, how times have changed. It's going to be I think it's going to be a big deal for all of us to watch what will happen and what doesn't happen. First of all, who's invited and who will be there? And I frankly truly want to believe that my president will not be there. And but I think they're playing poker a little bit again about doing it or not. It would be a bad scene. You're going to see very few European nations in it, except for some that might, been leaning both ways. But it's also going to be interesting to see who's globally there. Will Xi Jinping be there, or at least the Chinese Minister of Defense? Will North Korea be there? Will Kim Jong-un be there? And how the world has changed to see that. And that would be a validation. I don't think validation is the right word, but surely they have been invited. And so there will be a calculus there. And if they're there, it just shows further how rogue with that relationship has become.
And of course, Russia have now admitted that they have got North Korean troops fighting for them. It's not a secret in Russia anymore that that's happening, not as much as it was originally. Do you think the Russians might even consider putting North Korean troops that have fought against Ukrainians into that parade?
Remember, it was 2009 or 2011. Can't remember the dates exactly. We had an American infantry company marching with the Russians in Red Square. So with all the other foreign contingents. So this is also countries playing their hand. President Trump did not say 100% conditionally no. And but there will be significant consternation in my country, in Europe, among our allies and friends. And but in my mind, it shows how rogue the Russians have gone. Who could have imagined 10 years ago or 5 years ago or 3 years ago you'd have, nobody knows the true number, 11 to 14,000 North Korean, ostensibly special forces fighting now face to face and being killed in large numbers in Kursk.
We saw this week Steve Witkoff in Russia. President Trump has put out a Truth Social post saying that Witkoff, who of course has been acting as a sort of envoy to Russia, wasn't made to wait for something like 8 hours in the Kremlin when he brought the US's ceasefire proposals to Putin, as earlier reports had suggested. You were a military attaché to Russia for some time, as you say. Will US representatives have to worry about the Russians using negotiating ploys like that and having tactics and strategies for how they approach these talks?
It was a hard time between 2012 and 2014 because we were at the final stages of the reset, and the ground would shift regularly, and it was hard. And when the invasion occurred, the buildup to the invasion, we were told flat to our faces that no, this is not this. These are not Russian soldiers in Crimea. And so our meetings with the Russians were increasingly formal and official. They always were, but there was a little bit of a different relationship. So it was getting cold. And then you had all the other things going on. So now it's interesting because we were in the original discussion with the delegations a few weeks ago, US and Russian, they talked about restaffing the embassies, both in Washington and Moscow. I mean, they weren't, the embassies were not empty, but they've been reduced to skeleton crews. And so that was a sign. That was actually a pretty good giveaway for the Russians. But yes, it had gotten harder and harder.
And I just want to finish looking more widely at Trump's impact on NATO. As we've seen, the push to these negotiations has driven more of a reaction, more action from Europe. At the same time, there are some fears that the US could be less involved in European security now. How worried do you think European nations should be about the US involvement in European security? And actually, is it a good thing that they are more concerned now about their own security?
The answer for your second question is easy. Yes, they should be more concerned. The question, and it's for all of us, is would we be involved? And how deeply would we be involved if there were an invasion into the Baltic nations, or the nations hanging out on the edge of the alliance? And the good news is that Europe is steadily beefing up, but it's going to take time. We don't rebuild in 6 months. And then our own politics. There is clearly a shift, or maybe not a shift, looking back at the last Trump administration, but it is a reorientation to let the Europeans need to pay their share and put more skin in the game, more military, and all that. Those of us that support us being there, and I'm an old NATO guy for 34 years with U.S. forces. We always have been, and what will that look like? And if pushed, if the Russians blatantly, and I emphasize blatantly, invade one of these countries, and you have the gray zone wars, the various disinformatia and cyber going on all the time. But at what extent does it break Article 5? And what will Article 5 look like? One nation attacked, all come to its defense. And unfortunately, we have words can be unsettling and destabilizing too. And even suggesting that heartens the Russians. So it's going to be fluid, always will be. But what happens in Ukraine or doesn't is the paramount question that can drive a lot of these questions. Finally, if Ukraine's somehow is beaten in a major way, but just to the four oblasts in Crimea, and the lines hold, meaning without too much destabilization, because you're never going to fully stabilize a line in contact like we saw during Minsk. But if the Russians settle into the four oblasts that I talked about and get set and they solidify in there, then that's the question. What comes? Are they emboldened? And right now, Putin is kind of, it comes out that, there's certainly more than subtle strains of conversations coming out of Russia, that Russia should have what it had, during the Cold War. So, I mean, it's out there. But yes, the fact that, and Trump actually, if you remember when he was out of power, he was very proud and mentioned a number of times that his actions forced Europe to beef up the first time. So that's all there, but I end on that note is, again, our Congress and our people, many of our people would be acutely uncomfortable if this becomes a vicious all of Ukraine invasion, as bad as it's been. I mean, the Russians said right out, we wanted to decapitate the Ukrainian government, put in our own guy, and they very well almost did that in the first week in 2022.
Well, Brigadier General Peter Zwack, thank you very much for joining us today on the Trump Report.
Hey, Lewis, always a pleasure to our friends and our British allies and friends.